Today we are blessed to have Dr. Aaron Horton to do a presentation today. Dr. Horton is in German cultural history. He is the author of POWs. I do not speak German, so I'm sorry if I botched this. Thank you. In the genesis of a Group 47, the political journey of Alfred Anders and Hans Werner Victor. His recent publications, including several book chapters and the edited volume in Identity in Professional Wrestling, essays on nationality, race, and gender. This deals with the confluences of identity and popular culture in film and music and sports. So without further ado, Dr. Horton.
Thank you.
Get on so you can monitor the chat.
All right, so today I'm going to talk about a very unusual professional wrestling event in 1995 that, oddly enough, ended up being the most attended professional wrestling event in history, strangely enough, and we're going to explore why that was as we go through this. It's a sort of strange confluence of a pro wrestler / politician from Japan and the North Korean government's interest in using sports as a means of improving its image, self-promotion. So we're going to look at that today over the course of this lecture, and I will certainly be happy at the end to hear any questions or comments anyone may have. So obviously, because professional wrestling is a pseudo sport, so it's predetermined, meaning that it's part performance and part athletics. So the predetermined nature of pro wrestling means that it has a lot of potential for propaganda. And a year ago, I talked about, in this very room, I talked about patriotic professional wrestling gimmicks and sort of promoters' attempts to use contemporary issues to appeal to fans, whether it was the Iraq War or various other things, evil Nazis in pro wrestling here in the States. Because of its nature, pro wrestling it's a pretty potentially effective, or at least potentially exploitative propaganda tool. I'm not sure how effective it always is, but one of the more recent examples of this sort of thing is WWE's ongoing relationship with Saudi Arabia. They have a very lucrative deal where they periodically stage events in Saudi Arabia for large sums of money. And the Saudi government at times has used this to promote a positive image of itself. So during the shows, they try to sort of sanitize or whitewash their reputation in the eyes of the world through the lens of holding these WWE events there. The first one was in Jeddah in April 2018, and there you see an image from it. But this is by far not the first time that a nation has used pro wrestling or attempted to use pro wrestling as a means of self-promotion and a means of promoting a certain image of itself to the outside world. So April 28th and 29th, 1995, this wrestling event we're going to talk about took place at the Regatta 1st of May Stadium in Pyongyang, North Korea. And it was officially called the Pyongyang International Sports and Culture Festival for Peace, which was primarily a wrestling event. There were some pre-wrestling festivities that I'm not really going to get into, but the main focus was a 2-day wrestling event at this stadium. And These are the two largest single-day crowds in pro wrestling history. Around 150,000 people the first night and 165,000 the second night, which, for comparison, the largest, probably, Vince McMahon has fudged the numbers a little bit on this, but probably the largest crowd, the third largest crowd behind these two would probably be one of the WrestleManias in the low 90,000s. So supposedly WrestleMania 3 in Detroit was 93,000. There are questions about that number. It may have been inflated, but the point is this is significantly more than the largest recorded attendance of any pro wrestling show. So it's kind of strange that of all places, it's in a country that has no pro wrestling to speak of. So how does this happen? How do we end up with over 300,000 people attending a wrestling show in Pyongyang, North Korea in 1995, setting these improbable records? So this revolves around a Japanese pro wrestler and politician named Antonio Inoki, and not his given name, his birth name was Kanji Inoki. Antonio's a nickname, but that's what he went by. And the questions we're going to look at here are first, why in the world did Antonio Inoki and the North Korean government decide to stage a pro wrestling event in a country that really didn't even know what pro wrestling was, a country with basically no history of it? So what do they hope to gain from staging this event? How does this event fit the broader context of Inoki's and the DPRK government's usages of sports as political tools? And finally, what is the event's significance in the history of professional wrestling, possibly aside from the incredibly astounding attendance numbers? So we'll get to each of these points over the course of the next few minutes. So first, just a short introduction to one of the key players here, Kanji Inoki, who in his career goes as Antonio Inoki. Very important figure in the history of professional wrestling in Japan, probably the second most important figure, and certainly one of the three most important figures in the history of pro wrestling in Japan. I'll say more about another figure, the most important figure, momentarily. The Antonio comes from his youth spent in Brazil. His family moved from Japan to Brazil when he was a teenager to work in the Japanese immigrant community there, to work as agricultural laborers. So the name Antonio is sort of a nod to the time he spent in Brazil. Inoki founded New Japan Pro Wrestling, which continues to be, as of 2023, the largest and most successful Japanese pro wrestling company. He founds it in 1972. He also, toward the tail end of his career, began to transition into politics. So sort of not unlike Jesse Ventura or well, I guess he's the most famous example, but not unlike other figures associated with pro wrestling who then moved into politics. He was elected in 1989 to the Japanese legislature's House of Councilors, which is roughly equivalent to our Senate. It's the upper house in the legislature. And that's an important fact for the staging of this pro wrestling event.
What's pro wrestling?
Oh, yes. Pro-res is just the Japanese word for pro wrestling. It's sort of a condensation of Puro Netsuringu, so it's just short for that. And so when we talk about pro wrestling, those of us that follow it, it's a way to sort of designate when we're talking about Japanese pro wrestling specifically. So Inoki, as a politician, developed a reputation for being something of a maverick, in that he frequently did things without the approval of the Japanese government. In December 1990, he traveled to Iraq and met with Iraqi officials, including Saddam Hussein, and negotiated the release of 41 Japanese citizens who were being held in Iraq. Remember, this is right before the Gulf War. This is during Desert Shield. So many foreign nationals were in Iraq and unable to leave. So he goes there and negotiates the release of 41 Japanese citizens, allowing them to return home. This is sort of on the one hand, a political victory, but on the other, he did it despite being told by the Japanese government not to go. Just went anyway. He will later claim in 2012, I think it is, he will later claim that during this visit to Iraq, he converted to Islam, although he didn't mention it until 22 years later. So that's an odd side note that I'll come back to. But his colleagues in the Japanese government accused him of just sort of doing this for attention. In fact, when he returned with the Japanese hostages to Japan, and one of the first things he did was lead them in his pro wrestling catchphrase, Ichi San Da, 1, 2, 3, yeah, basically. So he leads them, and he's still an active pro wrestler at this point, and the principal owner of New Japan. So he comes back and does his pro wrestling shtick. So a lot of his colleagues sort of saw this as maybe not necessarily such a charitable act, but a way of advancing his political career. And here he is with Hulk Hogan, very early in Hulk Hogan's career. In 1994, he gets embroiled in a political scandal ahead of his re-election campaign in 1995. He was accused of tax evasion and embezzlement. And so he's facing some serious problems going into his attempt to get reelected in 95. So again, we're setting the stage for this unusual professional wrestling event in 1995. So on the other side of the equation, some important things have been happening in North Korea around this time. After 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the North Korean government, which had been heavily reliant on the Soviet Union as its primary trading partner, receiving things like oil at heavy discounts, other necessary resources that the Soviet government was essentially providing them below cost as part of their alliance, that's been cut off. The new Russian government is trying to tighten the purse strings, so to speak, tighten up the budget. North Korea really struggles economically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China somewhat takes the place of the Soviet Union as that key trading partner, but it's not quite to the level of aid that the Soviets have been providing. That means they enter a period of increasing economic difficulties, and in 1994, the beginning of a lengthy period of famine from 94 to 98 that will claim up to 3.5 million lives, the so-called arduous march, as it was dubbed by the North Korean government. In the midst of these developments, you also have a change in leadership as Kim Il-sung dies in 1994, the founder and longtime leader, the great leader, as he was called, of North Korea. He is replaced by his son, Kim Jong-il, who, as you see pictured here, had been the heir apparent for a very long time, but it is looking to, in 94 and 95, in the midst of this emerging famine, in the midst of other economic problems, Kim Jong-il was looking to legitimize his own leadership and to cement himself as as the undisputed new leader to prove to the country that he can live up to his father's legacy as the founder and leader of North Korea. So we have Inoki and Kim Jong-il both looking for something to be a very spectacular demonstration, a spectacular political tool to serve their various purposes. Now, the third element to this is someone who had died long before the events that we're discussing, but someone who was very relevant to the relationship between Inoki and North Korea. And that figure is the man who brought professional wrestling, American-style professional wrestling, to Japan in the first place. A man named Ricky Dozen. His birth name, Ricky Dozen, is his sumo name. Sumo wrestlers take a sort of name that projects strength and manliness. Ricky Dozen means strong mountain road, more or less. He had a bit of a problematic secret, though, and that secret was he was born in Korea, and he was Korean, not Japanese. As a young man, he's born in colonial Korea, it's a colony of Japan in the 1920s. He immigrates to Japan to pursue a career as a sumo wrestler, but he discovered that there was a glass ceiling for him because of his Korean origins. Even though he took a Japanese name, even though the man who trained him and discovered him essentially claimed him as his son, and they sort of tried to conceal his Korean origins, there were enough whispers about it that it was still working against him in his career. So he was frustrated with the fact that he would probably never ascend to the highest ranks of sumo because of his Korean origins. Then in the early 50s, he meets touring American and Canadian pro wrestlers who are doing USO shows, and they train him in American style pro wrestling, that is, work performance style pro wrestling. And he decides to start promoting it himself and training other Japanese wrestlers to, including Inoki and various others. And the weird thing about Ricky Dozen, who dies in 1963 after being stabbed by a Yakuza gangster who had a seemingly urine-soaked knife. That's what has been thought or reported. He got a septic infection and died a few days later. But a nightclub altercation. He apparently liked to drink heavily and get boisterous at nightclubs, and got into an altercation with the Yakuza man, and he died. But the North Korean government will sort of retroactively make Ricky Dozen this icon of Korean manliness. In fact, they published a biography of him in 1989, and I have a physical copy of it. They also published some copies of it in English for some reason. But this biography is, shall we say, lacking in historical accuracy. In fact, it claims that the Yakuza man who killed him because he was Korean, and that it was a sinister plot by the Japanese government to get rid of him because they were so ashamed that a Korean man was stronger. Remember, they're operating under the assumption pro wrestling is real. That he was stronger than all the Japanese wrestlers, so they were ashamed of this, that he was getting the better of all the Japanese wrestlers, so they needed to get rid of him. So there's this entire lengthy explanation of this in this North Korean heavily air quotes here biography of Ricky Dozen, who again liked to party, liked to get noisy, liked to get drunk, and probably just ran afoul of the wrong guy one night. No conspiracy involved, but that's retroactively what the North Korean government will claim. There are children's comic books depicting him and his life story in North Korea about his his Korean manliness and how he went to Japan and beat up all the Japanese people in pro wrestling. Like, it very strange. He did, in fact, send gifts to Kim Il-sung. We do know that. In fact, one of them is on display at a museum located at his childhood home, which is located in what is now North Korea. There's a museum dedicated to him there, including I think it's a Rolls Royce. It's a high-end luxury car that he gifted to Kim Il-sung. So he did have some contact with the North Korean government, and enough that they retroactively sort of lift him up as this heroic figure, a tragic figure who was murdered for being a Korean who was too good at pro wrestling, even though the rest of us know that the outcomes were predetermined, right? He ran the company, so he won the most matches. He was the biggest star. But North Korea, since they can't use Rikidozan for propaganda purposes since he died in 1963, the next best option is his number one protege, Antonio Inoki. And Kim Il-sung had been in talks with Inoki to stage some sort of event to commemorate Rikidozan and to perhaps promote Japanese-North Korean cooperation and peace and understanding when the elder Kim died in 1994. So Inoki was actually planning to travel to North Korea in 1994, but his plan was called off because of the requisite mourning period upon the death of Kim Il-sung. However, he remained in contact with the new regime, the regime of Kim Jong-il, and through those negotiations, they decided to stage a pro wrestling event in Pyongyang, and this is the stadium, it's enormous, in April 1995. This is going to be a New Japan event, so it's mainly using Japanese wrestlers from Inoki's company, with some involvement from Americans who also work for New Japan, and, well, one notable exception who came over specifically for this, sent by WCW in the US. Inoki, as he is working on setting up this event, is claiming publicly that this is about improving Japanese North Korean relations. But Inoki is also desperately in need of a political victory in an election year, because those elections are coming up shortly after this event is to be staged. And he's hoping that being seen as a peace ambassador will be enough to save him from defeat in his re-election bid. So, and kind of make everyone forget about the embezzlement and tax evasion issues he had been facing since the previous year. So, World Championship Wrestling, owned by Ted Turner, based out of Atlanta, had several wrestlers who were involved in this event. Hulk Hogan, who had recently moved from the WWF to WCW, was asked to be Inoki's opponent at the North Korea show. He said no, probably for two reasons. If you know anything about Hulk Hogan, he didn't really like to lose. He's very concerned about his reputation. He was very reluctant usually to lose matches, unless only on very rare occasions. He also may have been concerned about going to North Korea, which didn't have the greatest reputation for treating foreigners. Well, it didn't have the greatest reputation, right? Authoritarian regime, and we'll get more into that in a minute for those who did go. But Ric Flair, the legendary Ric Flair, Nature Boy Ric Flair, very famous wrestler, one of the top stars in WCW, agreed to go to face Inoki in the main event. This is Eric Bischoff here, who was the executive vice president of WCW, who claimed that Hulk Hogan was not interested and that you would have an easier time rowing a boat to Pluto than getting Hogan to go to North Korea and lose to Inoki. So there are a lot of stories out there about this trip, particularly from the American wrestlers who experienced a great deal of cultural shock when they traveled to North Korea in April 1995 for this event. So the wrestlers were split into two groups, and they were basically accompanied, except for when they slept at night in their hotel rooms, they were accompanied by handlers the entire time. So they're never allowed to go anywhere on their own. They're being closely watched and accompanied by guides, North Korean guides, the entire time. And one of the first things they do upon arrival is visit the Mansudae Monument, this enormous pair of statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. And there's video of this you can see on YouTube of them laying flowers at the feet of this statue. And it's on film, right? So that the North Korean government can show this on TV and say, look, here are a bunch of Americans, including Ric Flair, honoring. Look how much they respect our great leaders. Apparently, the North Korean version of this was talking about how these wrestlers couldn't wait to go lay flowers at the feet of Kim Il-sung, their recently deceased leader, and that they sang his praises and everything. Of course, the wrestlers tell a different story, but this is useful in terms of making it appear to the North Korean people that we've got people coming here from Japan and from the United States who respect and admire our leaders, so much so that the first thing they wanted to do was lay flowers at the feet of their statues. So there are a lot of interesting anecdotes here, and I'm just going to share a couple of them because you could go on and on about this. So Eric Bischoff accompanied the group on the trip, and he one morning decided he was going to go out for a jog, and he assumed, that it was quiet around the hotel, so he goes out and just starts jogging. The handlers must have missed him. He just started jogging, and he noticed as he's running around that the North Koreans on their morning walks to work, they start staring at him like, here's this American guy just jogging down the street, which is something you don't really see in North Korea. And he said some people started running away from him, like going to the other side of the street, like they thought he was crazy. He's just running around, right? And then he turns around and the handlers are chasing after him. And they finally catch up to him and in no uncertain terms warn him not to do this again. The other one I'm going to share is kind of scary. Scott Norton, an American pro wrestler who's been working for New Japan, was in his hotel room and had called his wife. And apparently he and his wife were having an argument because he had been away from home for like a month. He'd been wrestling in Japan, and she was, just typical married couple argument. And he was frustrated, and he said, I'm just so fed up, and I'm stuck in this crappy, awful country and all that stuff. And he says this to her on the phone. And then he said about 20 seconds later, these two guys, North Koreans, burst into his room and say, you got to come with us. So they'd obviously been listening in on his phone call, and they haul him down to the basement and start interrogating him, like, why are you saying bad things about our country and all this stuff? And he said, he feared for his life. He's like, I'm not going to get out of this room, right? They've taken me down here, they've locked me in this room, and they're interrogating me. And so he sort of diffused the situation and, kind of passed it off as just, saying things because he was upset with his wife. So they eventually let him go, but they did tell him, they said, you shouldn't say bad things about our country, right? You should remember to always say nice things because we've been very nice to you. And so he says, yeah, sure, no problem. But he talked about later how this was, he was terrified. Like he didn't know if he was going to leave that room alive. Also, at the very end of the trip, Ric Flair was handed a statement to read before getting back on the plane to Japan, in which he talked about how Kim Il-sung was famous around the world and how much people admire Kim Il-sung, and things that clearly Ric Flair did not actually think or come up with to say, right? But he was essentially asked to read this, and Flair said, I just read it so that I could get back to Japan and back. He said he kissed the asphalt of the runway, the tarmac, when they got back to Japan. But there are a lot of these sort of stories where wrestlers experienced a lot of culture shock. The event itself is a 2-day affair, 2 full cards. I think there were 7 matches the first night, 7 or 8 the second night. It's not like a typical pro wrestling event because the crowd doesn't seem to know what to make of it. Remember that there wasn't really this kind of pro wrestling in Japan. There wasn't this type of wrestling in North Korea. Some amateur wrestling, sure, but this is definitely different than that. So mostly the crowd just sort of sits there and stares in silence, not sure what to make of it. You have, on the first night, the biggest reactions were probably for the women's match. There were a group of women, 4 women who had a tag match from All Japan Women, which was a women's promotion at the time. Presumably because it was different, these athletic women having a match, the only women's match on either card. Shinya Hashimoto and Scott Norton got some reactions in the night 1 main event, probably because they're both really big guys, and they just sort of clubbed each other and did a lot of hard-hitting moves, and that seemed to evoke some reactions from the crowd. But of course, the main event of night 2 was Inoki versus Flair. The only time that these 2 legends of professional wrestling faced each other ever. In both of their lengthy careers, they only ever wrestled once, and it was in Pyongyang. Inoki wins. There's really no other viable outcome here. He has to win as Rikidozan's protege, as the focal point of North Korean propaganda efforts and the sort of retroactive glorification of Rikidozan. Inoki was presented to the North Korean people as a Japanese person who had the heart of a Korean, right? Because he had been trained by this great Korean. So he's sort of presented as an honorary Korean, right? Someone that it's okay to cheer for him, even though he's actually Japanese, which is often problematic, right? But here, the fans are given permission to cheer for him, and they do. Ric Flair plays the role of the bad guy, right? The heel, the villain, and Inoki, the virtuous protege of Rikidozan, the honorary Korean, defeats him. And the crowd did react to this. But remember that so much North Korean propaganda is built around anti-American sentiment and anti-Japanese sentiment. Again, they've tried to explain that part away. But to see an Asian man conquer the villainous American was evocative of the general tone of mountains of propaganda material in North Korean history. And here you're able to sort of reenact that in this predetermined pro wrestling match. So there are some questions about the financial setup of this event that have never been fully answered to anyone's satisfaction. So this is what is called a sold show in pro wrestling. That means that the North Korean government presumably paid Inoki a fee up front, a flat fee, and then they sold the tickets and collected whatever profits came from the actual ticket sales. But Eric Bischoff has recently claimed that the North Korean government didn't actually ever pay Inoki for the event. So that's according to Bischoff. Inoki never really said anything about it. So the details here are murky as to who got paid for what. We know that that Flair and the New Japan wrestlers were paid by New Japan. So New Japan paid its own talent. And whether that money came from North Korea, we're not entirely sure. So the finances of this event are mysterious. And the North Korean government, as you can imagine, has not exactly provided any enlightenment or information about it either. In fact, it's very likely that a lot of these people, this 150 and 165,000 that attended, right, they were just given tickets instead and told to show up to the event. This is what we call in pro wrestling circles, meaning giving away free tickets so that there aren't any. It is very likely there was some of that going on, that a lot of those tickets were given away and people were told that it is their patriotic duty to show up and make this event best. But we don't really know how many tickets were paid for, how many tickets were distributed for free. But remember, this event's primary purpose is not to make money. Primary purpose is for Inoki and the North Korean government to engage in self-promotion. So the goal here is political advertising, essentially, rather than to stage an event that is meant to be financially profitable. WCW aired an edited, condensed version of the event a few months later on pay-per-view, but barely promoted it. I remember seeing commercials for it, and I thought, well, that's kind of weird, right? Wrestling in Korea, North Korea. And not many people actually bought the pay-per-view, right? It was months after the fact, and WCW didn't really promote it very heavily on their American TV, so it just sort of flew under the radar and didn't really make any money to speak of on pay-per-view here. So financially, not very successful or lucrative. Inoki, despite trying to present himself as an ambassador for peace and to claim that he was advancing the cause of repairing or improving the poor relationship between North Korea and Japan, he lost his re-election bid about a month after the event. And he would continue over the course of his life and career to be criticized heavily in Japan for his ongoing relationship with North Korea. So the reaction back in Japan, even in 1995, was that this is more political grandstanding, that he is essentially using his pro wrestling skills of self-promotion here to try to advance his political career. And well, it didn't work. He loses his re-election bid. We can't say for certain what the North Korean attendees thought. Mostly they were silent, so that kind of indicates that they're not really sure what they're watching. At one point, Flair was sitting at the first night. He wasn't wrestling the first night. Flair was sitting next to a North Korean official in one of the boxes, and the guy said, the guy was talking to him as if it was real, right? So Flair said, well, I'll just play along, So, okay, yeah, it's really tough when you get body slammed and you have to do this and that. And so Flair said, it was clear that the guy didn't really know what pro wrestling was, right? So it's hard to say with certainty, but this sort of thing is not uncommon in North Korea. They have the Arirang Games, for example, and various other events that involve mass gymnastics displays, synchronized gymnastics, synchronized dances. This is sort of part and parcel of the North Korean government's attempts to show a nation that is fully in lockstep with each other, whose citizens are unified and whose citizens fully support the leadership of the country. So this is not so different than that. In fact, there was a lot of pageantry that preceded each day's matches. So they may have just rolled their eyes and said, well, you know, this is just more of the same, right? Just typical stuff that we see pretty often. But we will see further attempts in North Korea to use sports as propaganda. We'll see further attempts by Inoki to do the same. Inoki made 30 trips. This was his first one in '95. He will make over 30 more trips to North Korea after this wrestling event in '95. Frequently drawing criticism from Japanese politicians, accusing him of political grandstanding, accusing him of attempting to, accusing him of ignoring the Japanese government's desire for him not to unilaterally go to North Korea and take it upon himself to try to promote cooperation with Japan. He's reelected to the legislature, the House of Councilors, in 2013. And is going to continue traveling to North Korea in that span. He staged another wrestling event there the following year, a much smaller one in 2014 that didn't draw nearly as many spectators. I think it was maybe 10,000, so a much smaller venue. In 2012, I forgot to mention, I alluded to this earlier. In 2012, on a trip to Pakistan, where he was trying to promote peace and understanding and cooperation with the Taliban, among other entities, he claimed upon this visit to Pakistan that he had converted to Islam back in 1990 when he went to Iraq to free those 41 Japanese hostages, and claimed that at that time he had taken the Muslim name Muhammad Hussein Inoki, despite never informing anyone of this in 22 years since then, until he suddenly remembered this in 2012 in front of a predominantly Muslim audience in Pakistan. So how legitimate is that? It's very questionable, right? But again, in professional wrestling and in politics, individuals tend to misrepresent the truth and embellish for whatever their purpose is, to build themselves up, to advance whatever their agenda is, and that seems to maybe be what he's doing there as well. And it's just another example of the sort of his desire to use his pro wrestling fame to promote himself as this international peacemaker, even though it doesn't seem like there's any tangible effect. He never, aside from releasing Japanese hostages in 1990, there aren't really a lot of tangible outcomes to any of this, other than him getting criticized by the Japanese government. The North Korean government would continue to use sports as a tool for propaganda with limited effect, let's say. In the 2010 FIFA World Cup, and I wrote a book chapter about this a while back, the North Korean team qualified for the first time since 1966. And it was a bizarre campaign that the North Korean team had in the 2010 World Cup. They accused the South Korean government of poisoning their team, which is why they lost to South Korea in one of the qualifiers as they were attempting to qualify for the World Cup. They claimed their coach claimed that he was receiving advice from Kim Jong-il on an invisible phone during the matches at the World Cup. And then evidently they actually lost to Brazil 2-1, which is a really impressive result against Brazil. So they punched above their weight in their first group stage match. And then the North Korean government was so excited by this that they aired the next match live. The next match happened to be against Portugal, and they lost 7-0. And after about 4 goals, the North Korean government abruptly switched the feed over to a documentary of factory workers talking about how great Kim Il-sung is. So they cut away from it. And then apparently later went on to claim that they won the tournament somehow by showing randomly assembled clips of them scoring against other teams that they had played outside of the World Cup. So just a mess, right? But there were attempts there to use this to show that, you know, they could hold their own with countries like Brazil, one of the greatest footballing or soccer playing countries in the world. Many of you probably remember Kim Jong-un's highly publicized friendship with Dennis Rodman, former NBA player. Rodman organized an exhibition game, basketball game in North Korea in January 2014. Kim Jong-un, who spent at least some of his youth in Switzerland, was a huge NBA fan, huge Chicago Bulls fan. So this bizarre relationship seems to have stemmed from that. And the new leader, Kim Jong-un, who becomes leader in 2011, attempting to legitimize his own rule through sports. Look, Dennis Rodman is my buddy, right? Like these famous NBA players, well, former NBA players that Rodman had invited, they can't wait to come to North Korea and play basketball. There were also a couple of very interesting displays at recent Olympics. In the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney, Australia, and in the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, the two Koreas marched in the opening ceremonies together using a sort of unified Korean flag with the Korean peninsula in blue on a white background. So in both cases, this was seemingly a statement of some sense of unity among the Korean people, both North and South, although these sorts of positive instances are often interspersed with threats and bellicose, not warmongering, but bellicose threats from the North to the South most often. Usually these sorts of moments of positivity and unity they don't last very long. They're not indicative of any sort of long-term reconciliation because you can usually count on some, fist shaking and threats and test firings of ballistic missiles within a year or two of these kinds of things. The two had even discussed co-hosting the 2023 Women's World Cup, which, as it turns out, is going to be hosted by Australia and New Zealand. They never actually submitted a bid, but they were talking about doing so back in 2018. And then, as usual, those talks fell apart and nothing ever came of it. In conclusion, the 1995 pro wrestling event was sort of the perfect confluence of Inoki's and North Korea's desire to get a political win. For Inoki to maybe save his re-election bid, and the North Korean government to show that American and Japanese pro wrestlers greatly admired Kim Il-sung and went to all these famous tourist sites and wanted to come to North Korea to promote peace and cooperation and friendship. In other words, they wanted to legitimize Kim Jong-il, the new leader, by showing that we have friends around the world. And having Ric Flair's statement at the end seems to reflect that as well. This is part of a broader pattern of the use of sports as propaganda by both parties. And when we think about the lasting legacy of this wrestling event, I think, unfortunately, that the biggest legacy, since it didn't really have much impact at all in the States. I mean, most people weren't even aware it happened, even wrestling fans. Wasn't widely promoted here. In Japan, it mostly drew criticism and eye rolling at Inoki's grandstanding. In North Korea, the fans, the people there probably didn't even really know what they were watching, or they thought of it as just another big propaganda thing at the 1st of May Stadium. So the biggest legacy of this in terms of lasting impact is the sheer fact that these were the two largest pro wrestling crowds in history. As weird as that sounds for an event that was staged for propaganda purposes rather than for any financial gain, this 150,000 and 165,000, they weren't typical crowds. These are not 165,000 people who said, man, I can't wait to spend money to see Ric Flair face Antonio Inoki, right? Like it wasn't, most of them probably went because the government said, here's a ticket, go to this event. But that's impressive nonetheless. I doubt those records will ever be surpassed. I can't imagine that they will be. As I demonstrated, these kinds of things, even though the idea is self-promotion, the idea is, look how great our country is because foreign wrestlers want to come here, or look how great Antonio Inoki is because he's promoting peace and understanding with a hostile country. Generally, the effect is criticism and scorn rather than people actually buying in to the message. You have, for example, a lot of criticism recently of WWE's events in Saudi Arabia, just like there's been criticisms of, the new golf circuit that they started up in Saudi Arabia. There's been a lot of criticism of it too, or Formula One's race there. But that's the more likely result rather than people saying, well, I didn't realize how great North Korea really is until I watched this wrestling show, right? That's usually not the reaction you get. That's all I have to say about this, but I'd be happy to take questions or comments if anyone has them.
One of our faculty members that we used to have here at the War College was a defector from China. And when he was a young man, his whole family, who were all professionals, Mao took them and sent them out to farms to farm by hand with no machinery. And I asked him, I said, well, weren't you guys happy when they went through with loudspeakers saying Mao had died? And he says, no, we all fell to the ground and cried. I said, after what he did to you? And he said, well, he represented China. He was China. Now in North Korea, do the North Korean people have this Stockholm effect toward their leaders?
Oh, yes. Very much so. A lot of North Korean defectors have said that very thing. They've said that, even if they're living in South Korea, they've left the country, they've made it there. They've talked about still becoming emotional, like when they heard that Kim Jong-il died, right? Or when Kim Il-sung died, like they wept real tears. I mean, they were, because you're told constantly that these people are the great benefactors of the nation, that they're the people who are responsible for every good thing that you have, right? Even if on some level you know that that's, and they talked about this, defectors have, you know on some level that's not true, right? If you lived through the famine and you were scrounging grains of rice from cow manure, which is a real thing that people did in the mid-90s, on some level, yeah, it's been so ingrained into you that you still feel an attachment to these people because of that constant messaging. So in that sense, certainly the propaganda to the domestic audience is very effective. Yeah, for sure. Like it's definitely, that was a common reaction. Like when Kim Il-sung died, when Kim Jong-il died, and even people who were so dissatisfied with living in North Korea that they undertook the dangerous and difficult journey, usually through China, sometimes through Southeast Asia, to make their way to South Korea. Usually, even when they hated it so much they left the country, they still got upset when they heard the news that either of the Kims had died. So yeah, and I'm sure that there's a lot of psychological studies you could do sort of to explain that better. The psychology of
So like a battered wife syndrome.
sort of, yeah, like on some level there's this difficulty in separating, or there's a difficulty or there's a dissonance between reality and your emotional connection to the leadership, even though on some level you understand that their policies are in fact responsible for your misery and your suffering. Definitely.
Aaron, I'm curious about where is Inoki positioned in sort of the political spectrum in Japan, and which party is aligned in the Diet, and did he have any sort of a political effect in the couple of times he was in elected power?
The second time, 13 to 19, he ran. He attempted to found his own party called the Sports Peace Party or something. Yeah, something to that effect. So I mean, he was really going all in on this idea that sports is a way to bring people together, even though through all of his efforts, there's not really a whole lot of demonstrable effect. But
They could say the same about the Olympics as people invade each other last year.
yeah, oh yeah. But he the second time it was sort of a self-styled minority party. The Japanese government, of course, has numerous parties. He wasn't. I've completely gone blank though on his first. I don't believe he was in the LDP, which is the long-term majority party in Japan. There's sort of a I would call center moderate party. But the second time he attempted to found and never really gained much momentum. He got elected again based on his notoriety, but he wanted to, I guess, make this Sports and Peace Party a significant group, and it never really got much further than him getting elected the second time. There's another Hiroshi Hase, who's a former pro wrestler for New Japan. He's a longtime politician. I believe he is a member of the LDP, the sort of majority center right or center moderate, very middle of the road, I guess, liberal democratic party in Japan. He's been in politics for decades now, though, since his wrestling career ended. But he adapted to politics better. Like, he didn't try to bring the pro wrestling with him to politics like Inoki did. Inoki just couldn't help himself, like with the grandstanding and the posturing and everything. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
So instead of hitting each other with chairs there, did they hit each other with rice mats?
Oh no, they use chairs sometimes for sure.
So in New Japan, we would recognize it if we are used to the US, same type of acting out
Oh, yeah.
stuff and slamming and throwing them out.
Very similar, yeah. Yeah, it's strange in pro wrestling, the three major locations for the hotbeds of pro wrestling are the United States, Japan, and Mexico. So those are the three kind of historic hotbeds of pro wrestling, which all have their unique aspects, but it's definitely recognizable in all three places. A lot more elements in common than differences. Yeah. It's taken more seriously in Japan. Like they treat it more like it's a real sport. Than here we kind of wink and nod, right? Like pro wrestling, kind of, there's always a wink and a nod. Here in Japan, they tend to treat it more seriously. Mexico, of course, has the mask culture and a lot of spectacular acrobatics and everything that sort of characterize it. But they all have their similarities, but all their sort of regional unique elements too. Yeah.
You talked about American wrestlers going to Japan. Were there any famous Korean wrestlers in Japan after this? Are they still involved, or is it mostly other foreigners? And
There have been a few. One of the big stars in the 80s in Japan, Riki Choshu, was Korean born. And he was one of the top stars behind Inoki and a couple of others. He was one of the top stars. He was Korean born. And it didn't seem to be a hindrance to his career at all, because he was consistently one of the top stars. There's a guy now in Pro Wrestling Noah who's Korean born, Jake Lee. He goes by, I'm not sure what his actual name is. I assume Lee is the surname, but he's one of the top stars in Pro Wrestling Noah. So there have been Koreans who have done pro wrestling in Japan, but there hadn't really been a whole lot of pro wrestling in North Korea. In fact, none to speak of that anyone's aware of, which is probably why the fans sort of sat on their hands and weren't really sure what it was they were watching at this event in '95.
Did Stan Hansen ever beat Inoki in the ring? This is a question we want to know. Do you folks know who Stan Hansen is?
They definitely.
There's a hint in the name.
They definitely wrestled each other. As for results, I'm not exactly sure. Hansen wrestled much more often. He wrestled for New Japan earlier in his career, and then spent the majority of it wrestling for a rival company called All Japan Pro Wrestling, which was founded and run by Ricky Dozen's other pupil, Shohei Giant Baba, who was sort of a rival of Inoki's. So they were rival promoters, and they had been sort of frenemies, I guess, before that. But he founded his company in '72, the same year Inoki founded New Japan. But Stan Hansen spent the majority of his time in Japan working for Giant Baba, and certainly defeated Giant Baba and Jumbo Tsuruta and a lot of top stars over there. But for a long time, those two companies had nothing to do with each other. No, like, Americans would jump back and forth, some would, but the Japanese guys, you're either with Inoki or you're with Baba, and there was very little, like, they didn't wrestle each other, and it was a big deal if someone jumped ship and went to the other side. So there's a very big